A few months ago, I took a temporary job as a night security guard at an old, mostly unused prison facility. The place had been shut down years ago, but it still operated occasionally for storage and administrative purposes. They needed someone to patrol the grounds at night, and I figured it'd be easy money. The first few shifts were uneventful. Quiet nights spent walking the empty halls, with nothing but the hum of the fluorescent lights to keep me company. I wasn't bothered by the prison's history. It had been closed for over a decade, and I told myself the stories about it were just exaggerated. But then, during one of my shifts, I noticed something strange. I was in one of the lower blocks, an area that still had a row of intact cells, when I heard a sound. It was faint, like metal scraping against metal. I froze, listening closely. The sound came again, this time louder. It was coming from one of the cells. I walked down the row, shining my flashlight into each cell as I passed. They were all empty, just as they'd been every other night. But when I reached the end of the row, I saw one of the cell doors was slightly ajar. Oh, that shouldn't have been possible. All the doors were supposed to be locked. I stepped closer, my heart pounding, and when I looked inside, there was nothing there. Just an empty cell. I told myself it must have been an old mechanism slipping out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. That wasn't the last time something like that happened. Over the next few shifts, I started hearing whispers. Faint voices echoing down the hallways, too distant to make out. Doors would creak open on their own, even though I knew I'd checked them earlier. One night, I was doing my usual rounds when the power went out. The silence was suffocating. I radioed the maintenance team, but before they could respond, I heard a loud metallic bang, followed by what sounded like footsteps. I decided that night would be my last shift. Whatever was happening in that prison, I didn't want any part of it. When the power came back on, I went straight to the security office to monitor the cameras. As I scrolled through the feeds, I noticed movement in one of the blocks. On the screen, I saw a shadow move across the hall. It was quick, darting from one side to the other, but there was no one else supposed to be in the building. I grabbed my flashlight and reluctantly headed toward the block. When I got there, the air felt heavier, like the room itself was holding its breath. As I walked down the hall, I noticed one of the cell doors was wide open, the same cell from before. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around. That's when I noticed the writing on the wall, words scrawled in what looked like rust or dirt. It read, "You shouldn't be here." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. Panic set in as I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then I heard it. The whispers, louder this time, overlapping and coming from all around me. I screamed for help, but my radio was dead. The whispers grew louder, turning into anguished cries that echoed in the small cell. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The door creaked open on its own, and the hallway was silent. I didn't wait to figure out what had happened. I left the cell, grabbed my things, and walked out of the prison. I quit the next day. When I told my boss what had happened, he didn't look surprised. He only said, "You're not the first to report something like that." I still don't know what I experienced in that prison, but I've stayed far away from it ever since. Whatever is haunting that place isn't bound by locks or walls, and I'm not going back to find out more. About 2 years ago, I got a job working maintenance at a large correctional facility. It wasn't glamorous, but the pay was decent, and I didn't mind the solitude. Most of the work was done during the day, but occasionally I was asked to stay late if there was an emergency repair. One night I got called in to check a water leak in the East Wing, a part of the prison that had been closed for years. The inmates had been moved to a newer building, and the wing was now used for storage. It was mostly forgotten, which made it even more unsettling when I realized I'd have to go in there alone. The wing was silent as I entered, the kind of silence that presses down on you. I found the leak quickly, a busted pipe in the hallway near the old cell blocks. As I worked, I started to notice sounds. It was faint at first, like distant footsteps, but every time I looked around, there was no one there. I convinced myself it was just the building settling. Old places like this make noises, right? But then I heard something I couldn't ignore. A door slamming shut. I froze, my tools clattering to the ground. The sound had come from the direction of the cells. My first thought was that someone else had come in without me noticing, but when I called out, there was no response. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way toward the noise. As I approached, I saw one of the cell doors was closed. It hadn't been like that before. When I got closer, I realized the door wasn't just closed, it was locked. I checked the cells earlier and they were all open. My pulse was racing as I backed away, and that's when I heard it, a voice, low and raspy, coming from inside the cell. "Help me!" I froze, staring at the locked cell. The voice called out again, this time more desperate. "Please don't leave me." I should have left right then, but something about the voice kept me rooted in place. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer and shone my flashlight into the cell. It was empty. My heart was pounding as I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. They were heavy and deliberate, like someone walking toward me. I turned, expecting to see another staff member, but the hallway was empty. Then the voice came again, louder this time. "It's not safe. You shouldn't be here." The panic hit me like a wave, and I bolted for the exit. As I reached the main hallway, the lights flickered and went out completely. The darkness was suffocating, and I could hear those same footsteps now echoing from multiple directions. I stumbled out of the wing and slammed the door shut behind me. When I finally made it back to the control room, I told the overnight supervisor what had happened. He didn't seem surprised. He told me the East Wing had a dark history. Years ago, an inmate had died under mysterious circumstances in that very cell. Some said it was an accident, others believed it was something far worse. According to him, staff had reported strange occurrences in that wing ever since. Voices, footsteps, doors slamming, things no one could explain. That's why it was shut down in the first place. I quit a week later. I didn't need the money badly enough to deal with whatever was in that wing. Even now, I still have nightmares about that voice, and I can't shake the feeling that whoever, or whatever, was calling for help wasn't warning me for my sake, but for theirs. About a year ago, I worked as a temporary night guard at an old, half-abandoned prison. Most of the facility had been converted into offices, but a few areas still contained the original cell blocks, left untouched since the prison shut down years ago. My job was simple: patrol the halls, make sure the offices were secure, and report anything unusual. The first few nights were uneventful. The building was eerily quiet, and I rarely saw anyone except the occasional office worker staying late. But on my fourth night, something changed. I was doing my rounds when I heard a noise coming from one of the old cell blocks. It was faint at first, like a low hum or whisper, but it got louder the closer I got. When I reached the block, I realized the sound wasn't random. It was someone talking. The cell block was supposed to be empty. It hadn't been used in over a decade. I called out, but the talking stopped abruptly. I shone my flashlight down the row of cells, but they were all empty. As I turned to leave, I heard a single sharp knock behind me. It came from one of the cells. I spun around, heart pounding, but there was no one there. I reported the incident to my supervisor the next morning, but he brushed it off, saying the old block had a tendency to settle and make noises. I wasn't convinced, but I let it go. Over the next few nights, the noises became more frequent. Knocks, whispers, even what sounded like footsteps echoing through the halls. I told myself it was just the old building playing tricks on me, but then I found the note. It was a small scrap of paper, sitting on the desk in the security office. It wasn't there when I started my shift. Written on it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "Do not go back to Block C. If your second in command has contacted you, you know the direction he's going." The note left me rattled, but I tried to push through my shift. I avoided Block C for most of the night, but around 3 a.m. curiosity got the better of me. I decided to check it out one last time. The cell block was colder than the rest of the building. The air felt heavier, and I noticed the faint hum of whispers again, just like before. As I walked down the row of cells, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the cell doors was open. The cells were supposed to be locked at all times. None of the keys in the building could open them, and yet here it was, wide open. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight inside. The cell was empty, but the walls were covered in scratches, like someone had been clawing at them for years. Then, from the back corner of the cell, I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a breath. "Help me." I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The voice came again, this time louder. "Please, don't leave me here." I ran. I didn't look back. As I reached the end of the block, the lights flickered and went out completely. I could hear footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, following me. When I finally made it back to the security office, the lights were back on, and everything was silent. I sat there, shaking, until my shift ended. The next day I told my supervisor I was done. I didn't care about the money I wasted. By the time they got back, he was gone. But not in the way you'd think the stepping foot in that prison again. Before I left, one of the older guards pulled me aside. He told me Block C had been the site of an inmate's death years ago. The inmate had been locked in a cell during a riot and left behind when the guards evacuated. His body was there, but the cell was locked, and no one could explain how he died. The guards who worked there after claimed to hear him, always saying the same thing, "Help me." I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but whatever was in Block C wasn't natural. I still think about that voice sometimes, and I hope, wherever he is, he's finally at peace.